Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright, for today's Critical Thought, we're going to return to the topic of class-based design. A few days ago, someone suggested I look at Etrian Odyssey for a Dissecting Design, which I would love to do. And whenever I hear those two words, it makes me immediately go back to thinking about the pros and cons and the design considerations when you're building a class-based system. And class-based design has been the foundation for RPGs since the days of pen and paper, Dungeons and Dragons, and so on. And there are several reasons for it. The first is that it allows for a compartmentalizing of the skills and decisions when you're designing characters. If I have healing skills, well, they'll go on the cleric. Any kind of spells, well, wizard, there you go, warrior, and so on. It also makes it easier when deciding on characters. Instead of trying to build a character from the ground up, you have your choices: warrior, mage, thief, archer, and so on. And you can immediately recognize those character archetypes and know the options. If I see a warrior, I'm going to assume they're going to be good with weapons. An archer, we got a bow and arrow, and so on. And this also allows for very much a standardization of these themes over the years. For those of you who've played MMOs, you've probably heard the term the Holy Trinity mentioned before. And what that is essentially represents the three main archetypes that must be in any group in order to succeed. So you would have a warrior slash tank, someone to absorb the damage or distract enemies. The healer slash support, someone to keep the party alive and boost them when need be. And then you have the glass cannon, sometimes a thief, a range unit, of course a mage. These are the guys who you never want them to be in direct competition, but they're going to be doing the most damage. And this became pretty much the standard foundation for many, many RPGs with class-based systems. Now, the downside about class-based design, and where a lot of games have tend to mess up on, is restricting the actual number of options when it comes to play. And in earlier Critical Thought, we talked about the idea or the concepts of false choices. And that is when either an option is so good that you would be a fool not to include it, or something is so bad that taking it is just making the play worse. And class-based systems are a really great example of both sides of false choices. Going back to the Holy Trinity that we just talked about, this became basically the go-to standard for any kind of party-based system, be it a single-player CRPG or an MMO. You either had these three core pillars, or you're just not going to be able to do anything. Without warriors, your lighter classes are going to get killed. Without healers, no one's going to be able to heal themselves. And of course, without any kind of pure damage, you're never going to be able to deal with the enemies. And going back to what I said a few minutes ago regarding the compartmentalizing of these skills, many RPGs created one-note designs, meaning if we have skills like the spells, healing, and taunt or defense, each skill set would be locked to one specific class, thereby making a requirement to take it. If you want any kind of elemental damage, well, you need a mage or you're going to lose that. You want healing, cleric or bus, and so on. And what this does is essentially it limits your choice. It doesn't matter if you have 5 classes or 25. If you don't have someone who can do high damage, tank, or heal, everything else is worthless. And we have seen many class-based RPGs, especially those from the, I think the Might and Magic and so on, I think probably up to like the mid to late 90s of class-based systems where they give you everything. Not just warrior mages, you have jesters and farmers and again, there's just so many different names, and RPG fans will probably be able to throw a few here. But to go for and where I like to see class-based systems, I want to turn to two of my favorite examples. The first one, of course, being what we said earlier, Etrian Odyssey, and the second one being Darkest Dungeon. And both games followed a very unique or very great form of design philosophy that I think helped to elevate and downplay some of the issues that we see in class-based systems. And what they did was, instead of looking at skills in terms of classes, they looked at the skills in terms of utility. Meaning, instead of having all your healing skills be considered cleric only, what they said was, okay, we have different healing abilities. What classes could we fit them on? And we'll have a little exercise right here about what I mean. Like I said, in the older class-based systems, when we think of healing skills, you think of a cleric or holy man type class. But here's three names of skills. Nanomed Rejuvenation, the Fairy Dust Recovery, and Dark Ritual Blood Siphon. Now, I just described the titles of three skills, and they all have to do with healing. Now, what I just described, would you think that they would belong on a cleric, or again, the holy man type archetype that we see in older games? Probably not. And that's the point. Instead of looking at these skills as being essentially tied to specific archetypes, the designers broke down their skills into utility and then essentially divvied them up between the different classes. And Etrian Odyssey is a really good example of this. The first one, which is probably the most held to older CRPG design, locked things in pretty well. If you want healing abilities, you brought a medic. If you want any kind of elemental attacks, I think the class name was an alchemist. And this was again held back to the Holy Trinity of RPG design, especially with the post-game. In the original Etrian Odyssey, there were 3 post-game fights with elemental dragons, who basically, whenever they felt like it, would use an ultimate attack that would just hit the entire party for massive fire, ice, or electric damage. And basically, if you didn't have the Protector, who was the quote-unquote tank class, who has a skill to nullify one type of elemental damage per turn, the fights were unwinnable. And that's not hyperbole. They basically did so much damage that you couldn't mitigate it any other way. So what they did to combat this with Etrian Odyssey 2 and going forward was, again, they divvied up the different utilities across the classes. So you didn't just have healing skills on the medic. The Protector class, for instance, got healing as well. The Royalty class got the ability to heal using rejuvenation or health per turn abilities. You had some classes who could heal by doing attacks with certain skills. The point is, each class got their own, or the classes that got a healing skill got a variant based off of the core utility. So again, the medic is still the de facto healer. You want the best heals, you go with a medic. But you're not locked to having a medic. The same goes for the alchemist. Starting from Etrian Odyssey 2 and on, the different attack-based classes, some of them had skills that would correspond to different elements. One class could get like a fire blow, which would basically be, well, you do fire damage, but it's still considered a melee attack instead of a spell. But fire is still fire, and it would still be effective against ice-based enemies. And again, this meant that you weren't required to take specific classes, and you were free to mix and match on your own. And this really culminated in Etrian Odyssey 3, which I would honestly love to play that game on a stream sometime, because that game got crazy with the classes. To give you a case in point, I had a party that was made up of a pirate, a ninja, and a panda bear. And it kicked butt, too. In fact, when I played Etrian Odyssey 3, I specifically did not take a medic or the spellcaster class to see if I could build a party that could work. And not only did I do that, I built a party that went all the way to the final boss without having a dedicated healer. And again, that's because the options were spread out enough so that even though I didn't have someone who was the de facto medic or the de facto spellcaster, those skills were still a part of my party. And that certainly can be seen in Darkest Dungeon. Again, in the Darkest Dungeon, there are no true, going back to the Holy Trinity archetypes. Instead, once again, Red Hook took their skills and broke them down by utility. So, as a quick case in point, if we focus on attack or doing damage, you have pure damage, you have blight-based damage, bleed, and that is basically the main forms of damage. You have skills that will do more damage towards specific types, but those are the three main forms of damage types in the game. And again, instead of saying one class, this is the only class that can do blight-based attacks, this is the only one who can do bleed, what they did was spread it around the different party members. So, with bleed, for instance, the Houndmaster can do bleed, Jester, Flagellant, and the Plague Doctor. Oh, and of course the Highwayman. Again, the classes themselves aren't all doing the same amounts or the same kind of bleed-based attacks. For instance, the Flagellant has a really high chance of causing bleed, while the Highwayman is a little bit lower. But different classes will also do different amounts of bleed. The Houndmaster, for instance, with the arrival of the Flagellant, got his bleed per tick reduced because the Flagellant's considered the de facto version of that, or the best. But the point is, if I want to do bleed damage, I don't have to say, well, I either take the Flagellant or I have no bleed damage whatsoever. It's spread throughout. And while there are dedicated healers in the form of the Vestal and the Occultist, other classes have smaller versions or different variations of healing. The Arbalest gets a heal that gets boosted based on the number, it buffs the character so they get more healing next turn. And again, if we're not careful, I could spend the next 10-15 minutes talking all about the Darkest Dungeon. The Flagellant gets his ability that he can do a super heal once he's down to half health or below. And again, that's the point. Instead of saying our healing skills are really just holy, they broke it down by utility. And that's an important lesson for game designers, especially those of you who are thinking about building class-based designs in the future. Another good example of this that we did a little bit of streaming of on Twitch, which if you guys want to see, I can certainly stream a little bit of it on YouTube, was the indie game Zavix Tower, which is basically an indie take on the Wizardry series. With, again, you build a party of whatever classes you want, and you go up a randomly generated tower. Another good point would be how in Zavix, you can build your party out of whatever class combinations you want, and of course there are limits, and I think that's the final point for today's critical thought. Even though you can spread the skills around and make sure that there's a lot more class utility, there comes a breaking point. Again, you can have a party of 4 healers or 6 archers or anything like that, but at some point, basically, that dog won't hunt. And if you want a party of all warriors, well, they will certainly be great in melee, but then don't complain if you run into, physical resistant enemies who are killing you with spells. Likewise, an entire party of mages sounds all badass, but what happens when you run out of mana, or you run into someone who just kills everyone in a few hits? And that's kind of that line you have to think about as the designer. Just how far can you stretch the class-based design? Again, if you're looking at things from a point of utility instead of class, it can go pretty far. But at the end of the day, it's going to be very difficult for you to look at your game and say, okay, every possible combination can work. Even like crazy ones, like if we're talking about the Darkest Dungeon, take 4 Jesters into a group, or into the Darkest Dungeon, let them beat everything. But again, the point is, you have to be able to understand just what exactly is going to be required of the player. And this goes back to enemy design, which we probably don't have the time to get too far into today. But Everything about the party design, class design, and the difficulty of your game will stem from the enemies that you're going to fight. It doesn't matter, or for instance, if I have a boss who does heavy poison damage or heavy debuff skills, well then, in order to counter that, a party is going to need a healer or a support class. Likewise, if I introduce a boss who basically shrugs off all physical damage but is weak to fire, well, then I just create a situation that's going to require fire-based damage. And again, if you're going to create hard bosses like that require either specific combinations or a select number of abilities to win, then it's important to spread those out, or you may run into a situation where the player takes a party, 50 hours into your game, and then they run into a boss that they have no means of defending against, and they lose. And for those of you watching this, besides the games I've mentioned, can you think of other really great examples of class-based design? Now, one thing we didn't talk about that is probably going to be too long for right now are games that are built on unique classes. Stuff like Bravely Default, the job-based systems of some of the Final Fantasy games, and so on. But those kinds of games where we're dealing with more of a locked system like that is probably a little bit too much to get into for right now, since we mainly focused on the create a party kind of design of older CRPGs, and again the Etrian Odysseys. And before we wrap up today's critical thought, I want to ask you folks, would there be interest in me looking into a capture card option for the 3DS to be able to stream and look at games over there? There'll be an update video on the channel talking more about this, but I just want to get your thoughts on it. But with that said, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you enjoyed things, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know if there are any future topics you would like me to cover in a vlog. And check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GWBycer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and when we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.